I still remember the feeling of standing in front of my grandfather's old house. It had been years since anyone had set foot inside, but the memories hit me as if I'd never left. The once sturdy roof now sagged in places, the windows were boarded up, and a thin layer of snow covered the sagging porch. The cold bit at my skin as Claire and I stood there, staring at what was left of his life. I could feel her eyes on me, impatient and reluctant to spend any more time in this decaying place. But I needed this. There was something unfinished here, something that I hadn't realized I needed to uncover until I found myself at the front door. The house creaked as we stepped inside, the cold from outside slipping in with us. The smell of dust and mildew hit my nose, but it wasn't just that. It was the weight of history in the air. Old furniture covered in sheets, remnants of a life lived long ago, my grandfather's life. I could almost hear his deep, gravelly voice telling me stories about the old days, even though he had always been a practical man, a skeptic. I wondered, as I moved further into the house, how much of those stories had been left untold. Claire followed behind me, her steps careful, like she was afraid the floor would give way beneath her. "Are you sure you want to do this today?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. I knew she didn't want to be here. She had never liked the idea of my deep dives into family history, especially when it involved anything remotely related to urban legends. But this was different. This was my grandfather. As we sorted through his belongings, I came across an old box in the back of the closet. It was heavy with dust, almost like it hadn't been touched in decades. Inside, buried beneath a stack of yellowing papers and faded photographs, was an article clipped from an ancient local newspaper. The headline sent a chill down my spine. "The Hunt for the Gluss. Local men search for creature in woods." I froze, the paper trembling in my hands. The Gluss. That name triggered something deep in my memory, something I had heard before, but never really believed in. I could feel Claire's eyes on me, curious but impatient. "What's that?" she asked, peering over my shoulder. I handed her the article without a word, my mind racing back to the times my grandfather had mentioned the Gluss in passing, always dismissing it as a local legend, nothing more than a silly story that farmers told their children. But the article said otherwise. There, in black and white, was my grandfather's name listed among the men who had gone hunting for this so-called creature. The skeptic who had never believed in anything supernatural had joined a hunt for something most people thought was a myth. "This is what you're obsessing over now," Claire sighed, setting the paper down on the nearest table. I could hear the frustration in her voice, but she didn't understand. I didn't fully understand yet either, but I knew there was more to this story than just some legend. Why had my grandfather, of all people, gotten involved in this? And why had he never talked about it? "I just need to know why," I muttered, more to myself than to her. There was something about the Gluss, about this story, that felt unfinished, and I had to find out what my grandfather had been looking for. Our conversation was cut short when Claire gasped, pointing toward the window. At first, I didn't see what she was staring at, but then, just beyond the porch, a small figure appeared in the snow. A cat. It was limping, its fur matted with blood. "It's Milo," she whispered, recognizing the neighbor's cat that had gone missing a few days ago. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and headed for the door. "Ethan, wait." Claire called after me, but I was already halfway down the porch steps, my breath fogging up the frigid air. The cat was limping toward the tree line, leaving a faint trail of blood in the snow. I knew it was injured, and something inside me told me that if I didn't act fast, it would be too late. Claire followed reluctantly, her boots crunching in the snow behind me. As we got closer, Milo disappeared into the trees, his injured leg dragging behind him. I could see faint tracks in the snow, both his and something else. Tracks too big to belong to any animal I could recognize. My heart began to race, but I pushed forward. Claire stayed back, calling after me, but her voice sounded distant. All I could focus on was the trail of blood leading deeper into the woods. The snow began to fall more heavily as we entered the tree line. The dense forest loomed around us, and the temperature seemed to drop even lower. The only sound was the crunch of snow under our boots and the occasional rustle of branches in the wind. But something felt wrong. I could feel it in my gut. The same feeling I had when I first read that article about the Gluss. There was something out here with us. something watching. "We should go back," Claire said, her voice trembling slightly. She was right, of course. There was no reason to be out here, especially not for a cat. But something about this place, about these woods, was pulling me in. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that leaving now would mean missing something important. And then, just as I was about to suggest we turn back, I saw it, off in the distance, just beyond the thick trees. A shape, large and dark, moved between the shadows. It was only for a second, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The woods swallowed us whole. The deeper we went, the more the world around us seemed to close in. It was as though the trees themselves were conspiring to keep us in their grasp, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the fading light. Claire's footsteps were hesitant behind me, each crunch of her boots in the snow more deliberate than the last. I could feel her anxiety even without looking back. I wanted to say something reassuring, but the truth was, I didn't feel reassured myself. There was something about this place, something old and heavy in the air, and the deeper we went, the more suffocating it became. We followed Milo's tracks for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The snow had started to fall harder now, blurring the edges of the forest, making it harder to see. The injured cat's blood left a faint trail, staining the white snow with little flecks of red. But there was something else too. Tracks that didn't belong to Milo. They were larger, deeper, and they veered off in strange, erratic patterns. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out here. "I don't like this, Ethan," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. I could hear the fear in it, the same fear that was gnawing at the back of my mind. She was right. I didn't like it either, but something kept pushing me forward. Maybe it was the article about the glass, or maybe it was just my own stubbornness, but I felt like we were on the edge of discovering something. Something my grandfather had known about and tried to hide. The trees grew denser, their trunks thick with moss and frost. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement between them. Quick, darting shapes in the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. Just the silence of the forest and the steady fall of snow. Claire was tense, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as she struggled to keep up with me. "Maybe we should just turn back," she suggested, her voice shaking now. "It's just a cat, Ethan." I stopped for a moment, letting her words sink in. She was right, it was just a cat. But this felt bigger than that, like we were on the cusp of something we weren't supposed to see. "Just a little further," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even though my heart was pounding in my chest. "We're close. I can feel it." Claire sighed, but didn't argue. She followed me deeper into the woods, the snow crunching under our feet as we pushed past thick branches and low-hanging limbs. Then suddenly, the air around us seemed to change. The silence, which had been unsettling before, became oppressive, heavy. And that's when we saw it. Just beyond a small clearing, half covered in snow, a mutilated cow. Its body was torn apart, flesh ragged and exposed to the bitter cold. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sight was too grotesque, too surreal. I could feel bile rising in my throat, and I had to swallow hard to keep it down. Claire gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as she took a step back, shaking her head. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I muttered, stepping closer to the cow, even though every instinct screamed at me to stay back. The closer I got, the more obvious it became that this wasn't the work of any normal predator. The wounds were jagged, too erratic, too violent. It reminded me of the stories, those old legends about the glass. But that was impossible, wasn't it? I knelt beside the cow, staring at the torn flesh, the scattered bones, and for a moment, I swore I could feel something watching me from the trees. "We need to leave," Claire said, her voice more urgent now. I could hear the panic rising in her, but I couldn't move. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to my grandfather, that somehow he had known about this, and he had been hunting whatever had done this. The question that burned in my mind was why? Why had he never told me? Why had he kept this hidden? Before I could say anything, a voice called out from behind us. "You shouldn't be out here." We both spun around, startled by the sudden intrusion. An older man stood at the edge of the clearing, bundled up in a heavy coat and scarf. He had a weathered face, lined with years of hard work, and the kind of knowledge you only get from living in a place like this. "It's dangerous," he said, his voice gravelly, like he hadn't spoken in days. "Who are you?" Claire asked, stepping forward cautiously, though I could tell she was still on edge from the sight of the cow. "Sam," the man said, adjusting his scarf. "Used to know your grandfather, boy," he added, nodding toward me. "Knew him well." I stared at him, trying to place the name. My grandfather had never mentioned a Sam, but then again, there were a lot of things he'd never mentioned. "What happened here?" I asked, motioning to the mutilated cow. "What did this?" Sam's expression darkened, and for a moment, he hesitated. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," he muttered, glancing around the forest like he was afraid someone, or something, was listening. "But your grandfather, he knew. He was part of it." "Part of what?" I asked, feeling my pulse quicken. This was it. This was the piece of the puzzle I'd been searching for. Sam looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. Or was it something else? Whatever it was, it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "The Gluss," he whispered, the name slipping out like a curse. "It's real, and it's still out there." I could feel the weight of Sam's words pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. "The Gluss is real." I wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man, some twisted version of local folklore that had spiraled out of control. But the sight of the mutilated cow, the strange tracks in the snow, and the eerie feeling that had been creeping up on me since we entered the woods made it impossible to ignore. I glanced at Claire, hoping for some kind of rational explanation in her expression, but all I saw was fear. I could tell she was ready to leave this place behind, ready to walk away from whatever madness we had stumbled into. But I wasn't. Not yet. "We need to know more," I said, my voice more resolute than I felt. "What was my grandfather involved in? What exactly is the Gluss?" Sam shook his head, his weathered face pale in the fading light. "I told you, boy, you wouldn't believe me even if I told you. It's not just some animal, it's something else, something unnatural." His voice trailed off, and his eyes flicked nervously toward the tree line. He was scared, and that scared me. Claire stepped closer to me, her hand brushing mine. I could feel her shaking. "Ethan, please, let's just go. Whatever this is, it's not worth it. We shouldn't be here." But I couldn't let it go. Not yet. There were too many unanswered questions, too many things that didn't add up. Why had my grandfather, a man who never believed in the supernatural, been hunting something like this? And why had he never told me? Just as I was about to press Sam for more answers, a faint sound echoed through the trees, a rustling, like something moving just out of sight. I froze, my heart racing. Claire tensed beside me, her grip tightening on my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft whistle of the wind. Before I could answer, the sound came again, louder this time, and then through the thick underbrush, a small figure stumbled into the clearing. A boy, no older than 10 or 11, his face pale and his clothes torn. He was shaking, his breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps as he collapsed into the snow. "Oh my God!" Claire gasped, rushing toward him. I followed, kneeling beside the boy as Claire gently lifted his head. His skin was cold, and his eyes were wide with terror. Hey, it's okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, though I could feel my own fear rising. "What happened? Are you hurt?" The boy's eyes darted around wildly, like he was searching for something, or someone. His lips trembled as he struggled to speak. "He told me to find it," the boy whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "He said I had to find the Gluss." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced at Claire, who looked just as horrified as I felt. "Who told you to find it?" I asked, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. "Who brought you out here?" The boy's eyes flicked toward the trees, and his body tensed. "Mr. Crane," he said, his voice trembling. "He said I was Peter, but I'm not Peter. I'm Owen." I tried to tell him, but he wouldn't listen. I felt my stomach drop. Mr. Crane. The name sounded wrong, like it didn't belong to any real person. I had never heard of anyone by that name in this area, and yet the way the boy said it made my skin crawl. Claire shot me a look that told me she was just as unnerved as I was. "We need to get him out of here," she said, her voice firm. "Now." I nodded, but my mind was spinning. Who was this boy, and why had someone taken him? And more importantly, what did Mr. Crane want with him? None of this made any sense, but one thing was clear. Owen was terrified, and we needed to get him to safety. As we helped Owen to his feet, I noticed Sam standing a few feet away, his face grim. "You should listen to the girl," he said, his voice low. "Leave this place. Don't look back." But I couldn't leave. Not yet. Not without answers. "What is Mr. Crane?" I asked, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "What does he have to do with the glass?" Sam hesitated, his eyes dark with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, regret, maybe both. "He's something old," Sam said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Older than you or me, older than this town. And he's been looking for the glass for a long time." Before I could ask anything else, a sudden noise shattered the stillness of the forest. It was a low guttural growl, deep and menacing, coming from somewhere just beyond the trees. Claire froze, her eyes wide with terror. "What was that?" she whispered. "We need to go," Sam said urgently, his voice tight with fear. Now, without another word, we started moving, fast. Owen was too weak to walk on his own, so I scooped him up in my arms, his small body shivering against me. Claire stayed close, her eyes darting nervously around the forest as we hurried back toward the house. The growling continued, growing louder and closer with each passing second, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. But then, just as we broke through the tree line and into the open field that led back to the house, I felt it, that heavy, oppressive feeling that something was watching us. I turned, just for a second, and that's when I saw it. The figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing at the edge of the trees. Its eyes were dark, hollow pits, and its body seemed to shimmer in the dim light, as though it didn't quite belong in this world. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It wasn't human, that much I knew for sure. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest. I stood there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest, until Claire grabbed my arm and pulled me forward. "Ethan, come on," she shouted, her voice panicked. I didn't need to be told twice. We ran the rest of the way to the house, the growling now distant but still too close for comfort. I didn't stop until we were inside. The door slammed shut behind us, and Owen was safe in the warmth of the living room. But even then, I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the woods. Was it the glass? Was it Mr. Crane? Whatever it was real, and it was still out there, watching, waiting. The moment we shut the door behind us, I felt a false sense of relief wash over me. The warmth of the house was a temporary comfort, but I knew it wouldn't last. I couldn't shake the image of that figure lurking in the woods, its hollow eyes and strange, flickering form. The thing, whatever it was, felt like a shadow creeping over my mind, too close to be ignored. Owen was huddled in a blanket near the fireplace, his wide eyes darting around the room, as if he expected Mr. Crane to appear out of the shadows any moment. Claire sat beside him, trying to soothe him, but I could tell she was barely holding it together herself. I couldn't blame her. This was supposed to be a quiet final trip to my grandfather's place, a goodbye of sorts, and now we were neck-deep in something neither of us understood. The glass, Mr. Crane, the mutilated cow. It was all too much, but I had to hold it together. For Claire, for Owen. "What do we do now?" Claire asked, her voice low, almost a whisper. She was staring at me, her eyes pleading for some kind of plan, some direction. But I didn't have any answers. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of here, to grab Claire and Owen, and leave this cursed place behind. But there was nowhere to go. Not yet. Not with that thing out there. I glanced at the window, half expecting to see those hollow eyes staring back at me through the glass. "We can't stay here," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Whatever that was in the woods, it's not done. We need to get Owen to safety. Maybe the police can." "No," Owen interrupted, his voice sharp and panicked. "He'll find me. Mr. Crane will find me if we go back." His small frame shook as he clutched the blanket tighter around himself. "He said I had to find the glass, or he would take me again. He's watching. He's always watching." The fear in Owen's voice sent chills down my spine. I knelt in front of him, trying to calm him down, though I wasn't sure how. "You're safe now," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. "We won't let him take you. I promise." Owen shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "He told me to find the glass, but I couldn't. He said I was Peter. He kept calling me Peter." Claire's eyes met mine, and I could see the confusion mirrored in her expression. "Who's Peter?" she asked softly. Owen didn't answer right away. His eyes darted to the window, as if checking for any sign of movement outside. "I don't know," he whispered, "but Mr. Crane thinks I'm him. He kept saying it over and over. 'You're Peter. You have to finish what you started.' I don't know what he means." I exchanged a glance with Claire. None of this made sense. Why would Mr. Crane mistake Owen for someone else? And what was this obsession with finding the glass? It was like we were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle, something that tied all of this together. My grandfather had been involved in this hunt years ago, and now this strange figure was dragging a child into the same nightmare. "We need to go to the police," I said, standing up. "They need to know about this. Owen can't stay here, and we can't handle this on our own." I said the words. The house creaked. It was a small, almost imperceptible sound at first, but then it grew louder, a slow, deliberate groan of wood under pressure. My heart jumped into my throat. Claire stood up, her eyes wide with fear. "Ethan," she whispered, and then we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch. Slow, heavy steps, like someone, or something, was deliberately making their presence known. Owen's face went pale, and he pulled the blanket over his head, shaking with fear. "He's here," he whimpered. "Mr. Crane." I grabbed Claire's hand, pulling her back from the window. My mind raced. The front door was locked, but it wouldn't hold for long if whatever was out there wanted to get in. I could feel the terror rising in my chest, but I couldn't let it paralyze me. We had to move. Fast. "The back door," I said, my voice barely audible. "We need to get out of here." Claire nodded, her grip on my hand tightening. We moved as quietly as we could, guiding Owen toward the kitchen and the back exit. Every step felt like a lifetime, and I could hear the footsteps outside growing louder, heavier. It wasn't just one set of footsteps anymore. It was more, like something large was pacing around the house, circling us. Just as we reached the back door, I heard the front door rattle. Whatever was outside was testing it, and the sound of the door frame straining under the pressure sent a wave of panic through me. I pushed the back door open and ushered Claire and Owen outside into the cold, dark night. The snow was falling harder now, the wind howling through the trees, but I didn't care. We had to keep moving. We ran. My breath came in ragged gasps as we sprinted across the field, the snow slowing our progress. I could hear Claire behind me, struggling to keep up, and Owen's panicked sobs pierced through the wind. The woods loomed ahead of us, dark and foreboding, but there was no choice. We couldn't go back. We had to lose whatever was chasing us. Just as we reached the tree line, I dared a glance back at the house. My heart stopped. There, standing on the porch, was a figure, tall, thin, and impossibly still. Its eyes were hollow, dark voids that seemed to suck in the very light around them, and beside it, another figure, a larger, more monstrous shape, hunched and looming like a grotesque shadow. The glass. It had to be. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed Claire's hand and pulled her into the woods, the branches whipping against my face as we plunged deeper into the darkness. The wind howled louder, and I could hear the heavy, lumbering steps of something large behind us. It was following us, hunting us. Branches snapped behind us, and I could hear the growl, low, guttural, and far too close for comfort. We weren't going to make it, not if we stayed on this path. "Over there," Claire shouted, pointing to a cluster of boulders up ahead. I nodded, pulling Owen along as we ran toward them. We ducked behind the rocks, pressing ourselves against the cold stone, trying to catch our breath. I could hear the thing, whatever it was, moving through the trees, searching for us. My heart pounded in my ears, and for a moment, everything was still. The only sound was the wind and the distant growl of the creature stalking us. I held my breath, waiting, praying that it wouldn't find us. But deep down, I knew this wasn't over.